It began as a birthday surprise, a quiet drive into the countryside, a son's calm voice, and a mother's heart quietly hoping that maybe this time love would look like gratitude. But when the car stopped in front of a decaying shack, the surprise turned into something far darker. He handed her a single canvas bag and drove away. Abandoned on her 63rd birthday, Evelyn Reed thought she'd been discarded like old furniture. But what her son didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman they left behind was about to become the calm storm that would tear their perfect world apart. Because sometimes, betrayal doesn't end with heartbreak. Sometimes, it awakens something ancient and unbreakable inside a person. The need for justice. And as the dust from that silver sedan settled on the empty road, Evelyn's story was only beginning. A story of deceit, quiet vengeance, and redemption. The morning of Evelyn Reed's 63rd birthday began with the faint smell of coffee and the sound of soft laughter from behind a closed door, laughter that no longer included her. For 10 quiet years, she'd lived like a guest in her own home, tiptoeing through the rooms she once owned, careful not to disturb the lives that had taken over them. Her son Darren and his wife Tiffany ruled the condo now, bright white walls, designer furniture, and the emptiness of people who believed style could replace warmth. Evelyn's world had been reduced to a single small room, a converted storage closet that held her memories like fragile relics. Her late husband Paul's armchair, a few old books, a faded photo album. She never complained. A mother's love, she told herself, was meant to be selfless, quiet, patient, invisible. And so, on her birthday morning, she smiled politely when Tiffany handed her a cup of herbal tea she couldn't stand, and when Darren said he had a special gift, her heart, foolish and tender, dared to hope. Maybe it was flowers. Maybe it was dinner together. Maybe it was a little kindness, but the drive felt wrong from the start. The city skyline slipped away too quickly, the roads narrowed, and silence thickened in the car like fog. Darren barely spoke. Every time Evelyn asked, "Where are we going?" he'd murmur, "You'll see, Mama, it's a surprise." She tried to believe him, tried to believe the road still led to something gentle, but the further they drove, the more unease settled in her bones. When the paved roads gave way to gravel, and then to dirt, her chest began to tighten. Outside, the world turned gray and empty, fields strangled by weeds, abandoned barns with their roofs caved in. Finally, the car stopped before what looked like the skeleton of a house. A sagging roof, cracked windows, the yard overrun by tall, choking grass. Darren got out, opened the trunk, and set her old canvas travel bag on the ground. "Here we are," he said flatly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Your new home. Fresh air, peace, quiet. Tiffany and I thought it'd be best for you out here." For a moment, Evelyn just stared at him, her mind refusing to understand. The words didn't fit together. "They couldn't. Darren," she whispered. "What do you mean live here?" But he didn't meet her eyes. He only muttered something about needing space, about Tiffany's pregnancy, about how everyone would be happier this way. Then he turned, got back in the car, and drove away, without looking back. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. Evelyn stood there motionless, the wind tugging at her dress, the tall weeds whispering around her legs. She didn't cry, not yet. There were no tears left in her, only the numb echo of disbelief. How does a mother process being discarded by her own child? She looked at the shack before her, the rotten porch steps, the boarded windows, and something shifted inside her. For years she had bent herself to fit the lives of others, swallowed humiliation and called it love. But now, in the desolate stillness of that forgotten place, she felt something colder, sharper, awakening deep within her chest. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was clarity, a kind of hard crystalline realization that love without respect is just servitude wearing perfume. And for the first time in decades, Evelyn Reed decided she was done being invisible. She picked up the canvas bag, straightened her back, and walked toward the shack. The door groaned as she pushed it open, releasing a stale breath of dust and decay. Somewhere outside, a crow cawed, long and low, as if marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, carrying the scent of rot and loneliness. The walls leaned slightly, as though the house itself was tired, waiting to collapse. Yet to Evelyn, it felt oddly alive, a mirror of herself, wounded, forgotten, but still standing. She set her bag down, brushed the dust off a rickety chair, and sat. Through a cracked window, the evening light spilled in like liquid gold, softening the rough edges of the room. She could still see the road outside, the faint trail of dust from her son's car slowly settling back into the earth. It was in that moment that the shock turned to resolve. If Darren thought this was where her story ended, he was wrong. This was not an ending. This was a rebirth, a brutal one perhaps, but real. She whispered to herself, almost as if testing the sound. Enough. The word felt solid on her tongue, foreign but powerful. She didn't yet know how, but she would not let this be her grave. She would take her life back, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, breath by breath. The woman her son had left behind was not the one who would rise from this ruin. Night fell quickly in the countryside, not gently, but like a curtain being pulled down without warning. Within minutes, the faint light that filtered through the crooks in the boarded windows vanished, swallowed by a darkness so complete it felt ancient. Evelyn sat still, wrapped in her old cardigan, listening to the house breathe, the creak of its wooden ribs, the sigh of wind slipping through broken seams, the scurry of small creatures nesting in the walls. She'd never known silence like this before. In the city, even the quiet was full of life. The hum of distant cars, the murmur of pipes, the faint laughter of neighbors. Here, silence was an entity of its own, pressing against her ears, amplifying every heartbeat. For a moment, fear threatened to take over. What if the floor collapsed while she slept? What if no one ever came? But then, in that vast stillness, another sound emerged, her own breathing. Slow, steady, proof that she was still here, that she hadn't vanished like the rest of her life. The house, for all its decay, hadn't killed her. It was keeping her company. When dawn came, it arrived in streaks of silver light piercing the cracks in the walls, illuminating floating dust like tiny ghosts. Evelyn rose stiffly from the chair where she dozed off, her back aching, her lips dry. The world outside the window was drenched in dew, wild grass glistening like glass threads, the air cool and sharp. She opened the front door, and the hinges screamed, echoing across the empty field. The smell hit her first, damp soil, pine, and the faint sweetness of something blooming unseen. She stepped outside barefoot, her feet sinking slightly into the wet earth, and for the first time in years she felt grounded, literally, physically tethered to something real. Behind her, the house loomed like a dark figure watching her, but the longer she stared at it, the less menacing it seemed. It wasn't a tomb. It was a shell waiting to be filled again. She walked the perimeter, inspecting what she had been given, or, more accurately, what she had been sentenced to. Broken fence, half-collapsed shed, overgrown weeds. And yet, beneath the ruin, she saw potential. The wood was old but sturdy. The roof, though sagging, could be repaired. "You and me," she whispered to the house. "We're not done yet." By midday, she had explored every inch of her new prison. Inside, she found remnants of another life. A chipped teacup on the floor, a rusted lantern hanging crookedly from a beam, a yellow newspaper from 1984. Whoever had lived here had left in a hurry, or perhaps they too had simply given up. Evelyn knelt by the small wood stove in the corner, tracing her fingers along its surface. It was cold, but intact. If she could find wood, she could have heat. She laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound, realizing how foreign that thought was. Heat had always been a switch on the wall, not something earned. Hunger, too, arrived differently here, not as a nuisance, but as a reality. She rummaged through her bag, a few crackers, a small jar of jam, and the bar of soap Darren had packed, as if poverty required cleanliness. She ate slowly, deliberately, like a ritual of defiance. Every small act, lighting the stove, drinking water from a rusted tin cup, folding her sweater neatly, became a declaration. I am still alive. And with every motion, the frozen numbness inside her chest began to shift. She wasn't thawing, no. Thawing would suggest warmth. This was something else. It was solidifying, hardening into resolve. That night, Evelyn sat on the porch as the sky deepened to indigo. The fields around her whispered with the movement of unseen life, crickets, wind, the low croak of a distant frog. Somewhere far away a dog barked, sharp and lonely. She looked toward the dirt road where her son's car had vanished and felt no tears, only a strange clarity. She began to think, not as a victim, but as a strategist. Paul's face came to her in memory, his calm eyes behind his reading glasses, his voice saying, "Life can turn cruel, Evie. Promise me you'll never let anyone make you small." She hadn't understood that then. She did now. Darren thought she was alone, helpless, forgotten. He didn't know about the savings she'd hidden years ago, or the lawyer who still owed her a favor, or the stubborn will that had carried her through widowhood. The house creaked as if listening. The wind carried a chill, but Evelyn didn't move. For the first time since being abandoned, she wasn't afraid of the silence. She welcomed it. Because in that silence, a plan was beginning to form, quiet, sharp, and unstoppable. And soon that silence would speak. The second morning in that forgotten village dawned gray and still. The sky hung low, heavy with mist, the kind that blurred the horizon and muffled every sound. Evelyn sat by the small window she'd managed to unboard during the night, sipping water she'd drawn from the old well behind the house. Her fingers trembled slightly from exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp now. The helplessness that had weighed her down the day before was gone. She had spent a long night thinking, reconstructing every detail of her son's face when he left her, every word he said. Fresh air, peace, quiet. Those words played in her head like a cruel echo. It wasn't peace he wanted for her, it was disappearance, to make her vanish without noise or scandal. But what he hadn't realized was that Evelyn Reed wasn't ready to disappear. Somewhere in her old canvas bag, beneath towels and soap, was a relic of her former life, her small flip phone, long mocked by Tiffany as the gramophone. When Evelyn pressed the power button, the dim blue screen lit up like a lifeboat in the fog. The battery bar was nearly full. But there was one problem. No signal. Not a single bar. She stepped outside, holding the phone high, turning in slow circles like a sailor scanning the horizon for land. Nothing. The village sat low in a valley, surrounded by gentle hills, beautiful but isolating. Evelyn realized she needed higher ground. She slipped on her worn shoes and started up the narrow path that twisted behind the house, pushing through thistles and tall weeds that clung to her skirt. The climb was slow. Every step was a negotiation between fatigue and stubbornness. Branches scratched her arms, the damp air clung to her lungs, but she didn't stop. Halfway up, she almost turned back, until she thought of Tiffany's smirk, the way she said, "Mommy, it's better this way." That single memory hardened her will like steel. She kept climbing until, at the crest of the hill, the mist began to thin. A lone cedar tree stood there, twisted, wind-battered, ancient. Evelyn stood beneath it, chest heaving, and raised the phone again. One bar appeared. Then two. Her throat tightened. "Come on," she whispered, as if coaxing life from a machine. The signal held steady. She scrolled through her old contacts, names from a life that seemed decades away, and stopped at one, Mr. Harrison, Bank. Her finger hovered only a moment before pressing call. The ring felt eternal, stretching through the quiet like a wire of suspense. Then a voice, warm but startled. "Mrs. Reed?" "My goodness, it's been years." Evelyn's tone was calm, even, almost unnaturally so. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. I need you to do a few things for me." She gave her instructions with precision. "Block all powers of attorney under her son's name. transfer all incoming deposits to her personal savings account, and lock all external access. Mr. Harrison hesitated, polite disbelief lacing his voice, but something in Evelyn's tone left no room for debate. "Within the hour, please," she said. "And one more thing, no communication with anyone but me." When she hung up, her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that she'd just reclaimed the first piece of her life. She stared at the horizon, watching sunlight break faintly through the clouds. Then she opened her contacts again, this time selecting Marcus Jones, attorney at law. The young lawyer had once helped her with a distant cousin's inheritance, one of the few people she'd met who treated her like she still mattered. "Marcus," she said when he answered, "I need your help. It's urgent." "It's about my condo." The words rolled out steady and sure. For years her voice had been quiet, apologetic. Now it was the voice of a woman issuing orders. When she ended the call, she realized something profound. She was no longer asking for permission to exist. The climb down the hill felt lighter, almost effortless. The air smelled of pine and wet grass. Evelyn walked back to the house with her phone clutched tight in her palm, a faint smile ghosting her lips. For the first time since her abandonment, she wasn't merely surviving, she was acting. The shack, once a symbol of humiliation, now looked different as she approached it. It wasn't decay she saw anymore, it was cover, a fortress disguised as ruin. Her son thought he buried her in silence, but from this silence she would strike. She placed the phone carefully on the table beside the small stove and looked around the dim room. The walls no longer seemed to lean, they seemed to listen. "All right," she murmured to herself, voice steady. "We start here." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and the promise of reckoning. Evelyn Reed was no longer the invisible mother, no longer the obedient figure in someone else's story. She was the author now, and somewhere far away, her son's perfect world was about to tremble, though he didn't yet know why. By the following morning, the valley was drenched in golden light. Dew clung to the weeds like strings of glass, and the air carried that sharp, clean scent that only comes after rain. Evelyn sat on the porch steps, the old phone cradled in her hand, her mind strangely calm. She had spent the night replaying the conversations, Mr. Harrison's careful politeness, Marcus's quiet urgency. Her instructions were simple, but their consequences would not be. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, her son's financial world, the very foundation of his comfort, was being quietly rewired. And yet, as she watched the morning light creep across the porch, Evelyn felt no thrill of vengeance, no satisfaction. What she felt was clarity, that cold, precise calm that comes to people who've lost everything and therefore have nothing left to fear. "Let it begin," she whispered, almost to the wind. She picked up the phone and scrolled to Marcus's number again, needing to hear that her commands hadn't been swallowed by bureaucracy. When he answered, his tone was brisk but respectful. "Mrs. Reed, we filed the paperwork and contacted the registrar's office. Everything's in motion." Evelyn closed her eyes. The machinery had started to turn. While the system worked quietly in her favor, her thoughts wandered back to her husband, Paul. He'd always been meticulous with finances, a man who kept ledgers and double-checked every receipt. Before he died, he'd once said, "Evie, a signature is a sacred thing. Never give it to someone who treats you like a favor." At the time, she had laughed, brushed it off as one of his practical sermons. Now those words cut deep. She'd signed so many papers for Darren and Tiffany without reading them, trusting that family meant safety. That blind trust had been her downfall, but this was her resurrection. With every legal move Marcus filed, with every account Mr. Harrison locked, she was stitching herself back together. As she sat there, a small breeze rustled through the nearby trees, and for a fleeting moment, she imagined Paul standing at the edge of the yard, watching her with quiet pride. "I'm doing it right this time," she murmured to him. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, soft, promising. By afternoon, Evelyn had begun the physical work of reclaiming her space. She dragged a cracked table from the back of the house into the light, dusted it, and placed her phone squarely in the center like a commander setting up her war desk. The sound of the windmill creaking nearby became her metronome. She swept, patched, boiled water, and planned. Every chore was a way to silence the tremor of old pain to keep her mind sharp. When the phone finally rang, the sound startled her. A tinny, almost reluctant chime in the still air. The screen flashed Darren. Her thumb hovered, but she didn't rush. She let it ring twice before answering. "Mama, finally, what's going on?" Darren's voice came fast, uneasy. "Tiffany's card isn't working. The joint account says there's an error. The bank must have messed something up. Can you call them?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She could almost hear the nervous tapping of his fingers on the steering wheel, the way he used to fidget when caught in a lie. "No," she said quietly. Just one word, simple and sharp. "No? What do you mean no?" His tone rose, irritation masking panic. "Figure it out yourself," she said, and hung up. For a moment, the silence afterward rang louder than the call itself. Evelyn sat back and exhaled, her pulse steady. She felt the tiniest tremor of something like victory, not revenge, but equilibrium. Somewhere far away, her son and his wife were sitting in their pristine kitchen, staring at the flashing decline on a card reader, realizing for the first time that control was no longer theirs. She imagined Tiffany's indignation, the way she'd tilt her head and hiss, "She's doing this on purpose." They would call again. They would rage, plead, threaten, but Evelyn wouldn't waver. That old softness inside her, that need to please, was gone. She was done explaining her worth to people who already priced it so low. As the last of the day's light slanted through the broken window, painting the floor in amber, Evelyn placed the phone back on the table. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, slow and deliberate, tapping against the roof like the quiet applause of fate. The war had begun, not with shouting, but with silence. And somewhere in that silence, Evelyn Ray finally began to feel alive. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the roof still wept in slow drips, each one landing with a hollow tick that echoed through the quiet house. She sat by the window wrapped in an old blanket, the glow of her phone lighting her face. The call with Darren replayed in her mind like a scene from a bad dream. His disbelief, his panic, the way he had said mama not with affection, but with entitlement. She realized she had never really heard her son's voice before that day. Not the polite tones, not the flattery, not the rehearsed concern. The real voice beneath it, the one that had always spoken the language of possession. For years she had mistaken that for love. But love does not sound like ownership. Love does not discard you in the middle of nowhere and call it space. As the hours passed, she found herself thinking not of anger, but of patterns, of how many small concessions had brought her here. Every dollar she had surrendered, every silence she had kept, every time she had swallowed truth to keep the peace. The realization wasn't bitter. It was liberating. Her son had betrayed her once, but she had betrayed herself for years. And that, she decided, would never happen again. When the first light of dawn touched the valley, Evelyn rose with a strange, renewed energy. She made herself tea from wild mint she'd found near the well, the steam curling through the chilly air. Her hands, once soft and unsure, moved with purpose now, gathering wood, sweeping the floor, lighting the stove. Each small act rebuilt the rhythm of her independence. Between chores, her mind drifted to the years she'd spent with Paul, remembering the evenings they'd sit on their balcony, him reading aloud from the paper, her knitting quietly beside him. He had always believed she was stronger than she thought. "You've got more steel in you than most men," he used to tease. Back then, she'd blush and shake her head. Now she smiled faintly because he'd been right. There was a moment, a flash of memory, Paul sliding a folder of documents across the table years ago. "Everything's in your name, Evie, just in case." She hadn't understood then why he was so insistent. But as she stared into the fire, she whispered, "You knew, didn't you?" That old man's foresight had become her lifeline. What her son believed was his inheritance still belonged to her, legally, fully, irrevocably. For the first time in days, she laughed. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, but freely. It was the sound of a chain breaking. Later that afternoon, Evelyn climbed the hill again, the one where the signal bars rose like tiny promises. She called Marcus, her voice steady but warm. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "I've confirmed everything. You're the sole owner of your condo. No joint claims. No contest." Evelyn exhaled, feeling a weight lift off her chest, but Marcus hesitated before continuing. "However, I found something odd. There's a mortgage recorded in your name, a large one, from 8 months ago." The word struck her like a cold wave. "That's impossible," she said sharply. Marcus's tone softened. "I thought so too. But the signature is yours." Evelyn felt the world tilt for a moment. And then memory pierced the haze. The winter she'd been sick with pneumonia, Tiffany hovering by her bedside, bringing her papers, insisting they were just forms. Her hand gripping the pen, weak and feverish. Her trust. "You signed it," Tiffany had said sweetly back then. Evelyn's fingers clenched around the phone now. "Find everything," she said. "Copies, notaries, the bank name. I want every detail." "Already on it," Marcus replied. When she ended the call, Evelyn stood in the wind for a long time, the hilltop air slicing cold against her skin. So that was their plan, not just to exile her, but to erase her entirely, to let the bank take her home once the debt came due. She had been their guarantee. Their collateral dot as she descended the hill, the sky had turned crimson, streaked with gold. The house below looked small but solid now, her headquarters, her fortress. She knew what had to come next. They had used her signature to steal from her. She would use their arrogance to expose them. The cold inside her no longer felt cruel. It was discipline, sharp, unwavering. She sat at her small table, pen in hand, jotting notes as the fire crackled nearby. Every name, every date, every false kindness she'd endured now had a place in her plan. There would be no shouting, no confrontation. Justice would not arrive with noise. It would arrive quietly, through documents, through phone calls, through the same system they had once used to trap her. As night fell, she placed her pen down and looked toward the window. Outside, the valley shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere beyond that darkness, her son and his wife still believed they buried her. But Evelyn Reed was no longer their burden. She was the reckoning walking toward them, slow, calm, inevitable. By the third morning, the wind over the valley had changed. The mist was thinner, the air crisper, and even the birds sounded different, as if the world itself sensed the shift that was coming. Evelyn woke early, her mind clear and mechanical. She made tea from the last of the mint leaves and climbed the hill again, her shoes wet with dew. When she called Marcus, he answered immediately. "Mrs. Reed," he said, the energy in his voice unmistakable, "is begun. The bank received our complaint. All accounts connected to your son have been flagged. His cars, his credit, the joint funds, you name it. Everything's frozen pending investigation." Evelyn didn't speak for a moment. She just listened to the wind whip around her. The same wind that once sounded lonely now felt triumphant. "Good," she said simply. Marcus went on, explaining that the bank's fraud department was already requesting interviews, that her attorney's filings had struck nerves in all the right places. But Evelyn wasn't listening to the details anymore. She was thinking about the irony that the same financial world her son had used to make her powerless was now her greatest weapon. "Thank you, Marcus," she said quietly. "From here, I'll handle the rest." Far away in the city, chaos was unfolding in real time. Tiffany's morning ritual coffee, phone scrolling, ordering things she didn't need, had been interrupted by a message she couldn't process. Transaction declined. The same message blinked again at the grocery store, and again at the gas station. Darren tried to calm her, claiming it was a bank error, But when his own corporate card failed at lunch, panic set in. They called customer service. The operator's polite tone only made it worse. Your account is under temporary restriction due to an internal review, she said. Tiffany's voice rose, shrill and disbelieving. That's impossible, we have money. The operator apologized, repeated the same line and disconnected. By the time Darren reached Mr. Harrison's office in person, his charm was gone. Witnesses later said he shouted, demanded answers, even threatened lawsuits. But the bank manager, an older man with kind eyes, simply shook his head. Mr. Reed, this is between you and your mother, he said. And in that moment, Darren realized the horrifying truth. Evelyn was still alive in the system, and she was fighting back. Meanwhile, back in the valley, Evelyn worked like someone who'd been training her whole life for this. She cleaned, repaired, and planned, her movements deliberate, her thoughts sharp. Every chore became a kind of meditation. She scrubbed the floorboards until they shone. Not out of vanity, but discipline. Her surroundings had to match her mind, orderly, controlled, efficient. When the phone rang again that afternoon, she knew who it was before she looked. Darren. The name blinked like a warning light on the tiny screen. She waited until the fourth ring before answering. Mama, he said, his voice ragged. What did you do? The bank, our accounts, they said you blocked us. Tiffany's losing it, the mortgage, everything. Please tell me it's a mistake. Evelyn's reply was steady, almost gentle. It's not a mistake, he stammered, searching for a way back to the old script, the one where guilt and manipulation worked. Mama, we're family. You can't just... I can, she interrupted. And I did. She hung up before he could speak again. The silence afterward wasn't empty this time. It was peaceful. As night fell, Evelyn lit a small fire in the stove and sat beside it, watching the flames lick the iron grate. The rain had stopped, and moonlight seeped through the cracks in the boards, silvering the room. Outside, the world felt still, like the pause between thunder and the next strike of lightning. She knew there would be more calls, more pleading, maybe even threats. But that didn't matter. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt fortified. She had taken control of the one thing that had always defined her life, dependence, and turned it on its head. For years she'd believed strength meant silence, that goodness meant giving until nothing was left. But true strength, she realized, was measured not in sacrifice but in boundaries. She stirred the fire and leaned back, the glow painting her face in shades of amber. Somewhere miles away, her son was learning the same lesson the hard way. For Evelyn Reed, justice didn't roar. It whispered, patient and precise. And its whisper had finally reached him. The knock came just after noon. It was sharp, impatient, and completely out of place in that quiet stretch of countryside. Evelyn didn't move at first. She sat at her small table, the steam from her tea curling through the sunlight, and listened. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a familiar voice calling her name. Mom? Mom, it's me. For a long moment she simply watched the dust drifting in the light, her pulse steady. She had known they would come eventually. The frozen accounts, the rejected mortgage payments, those things had a way of driving the arrogant back to the very people they discarded. When she finally opened the door, Darren stood there with that same practiced half-smile, the one that used to melt her into forgiveness. But now it looked like a mask that no longer fit. Tiffany hovered behind him, sunglasses hiding her eyes, arms crossed like a shield. You look good, Darren said awkwardly. We were worried. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You left me here, remember? Her tone wasn't angry, just factual, the way you described the weather. The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Darren tried to fill the silence with words, excuses, half-truths, anything to dull the edge of his guilt. Tiffany didn't mean for it to sound the way it did, he said. We just thought you'd be happier away from the city, the noise, the stress, the mortgage. Evelyn interrupted softly. His eyes flicked up in panic. Tiffany's hand tightened around her purse. You forged my signature. Evelyn continued, her voice calm but cold. 8 months ago. On a house you called yours. You used me to get it. And when the bank started asking questions, you dumped me here like a problem you could hide. Darren stammered, searching for words. Mom, listen, it wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like, she said. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Even Tiffany, who'd built her life on pretense, had no clever lines left. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling the glass like an impatient spectator. Finally, Tiffany broke the quiet. Look, we just need access to the funds. We'll fix everything, I promise. You don't have to live like this. We'll move you somewhere nice. The false sweetness in her tone was almost admirable in its audacity. Evelyn laughed, a low, humorless sound that made Tiffany flinch. You still think money can buy decency, Evelyn said. You took everything I had and called it love. Now you want me to believe you're here to rescue me? Darren reached for her arm, but she stepped back. The movement was small but final. You should go, she said quietly. This house doesn't belong to you. It never did. Darren's mouth opened, then closed again. Something in his mother's eyes stopped him, not anger, but absence. The kind of silence that follows when someone has already decided they're done explaining themselves. Without another word, Evelyn turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind her. The latch clicked with a sound that felt like judgment. Outside, Darren and Tiffany stood motionless for a moment, the dust from their car settling around them. Darren's hands trembled slightly, not from guilt now, but from fear. The woman inside that house wasn't the mother he'd always manipulated. She was someone else entirely, composed, unshakable, untouchable. As they drove away, Tiffany muttered curses under her breath, blaming everyone but herself. Darren said nothing. His reflection in the car window looked older, smaller. Back inside, Evelyn sat by the window again, watching their car disappear down the dirt road. The quiet that followed was absolute, but not lonely. It was the quiet of completion, of a door closed properly for the first time in years. She breathed deeply, her chest rising slow and steady, and whispered, "Goodbye, son." Then she looked toward the horizon, where the road curved out of sight, knowing this wasn't the last she'd see of them. People like Darren never left cleanly. They came back, desperate, cornered, and dangerous. But Evelyn wasn't afraid. She was ready. 3 days passed before the quiet broke again. This time, Evelyn heard them coming long before they reached the house, the crunch of tires on gravel, the rising hum of multiple voices, the impatient slam of car doors. She was outside splitting wood when she saw them. Darren, Tiffany, and 2 relatives she hadn't seen since Paul's funeral, her brother-in-law Neil and his wife Carol, both carrying the brittle arrogance of people who thought they'd been summoned to restore order. Neil called out first, voice booming across the yard. "Evelyn, what on earth is going on? Darren says you've taken everything." She straightened slowly, setting the axe aside, and wiped her hands on her apron. The sight of them all city-polished, furious, pretending righteousness filled her with a strange, calm amusement. "Taken?" She said evenly. "You can't take what's already yours." Their expressions shifted, confusion giving way to irritation. Tiffany folded her arms. "This is ridiculous. We're family. You can't just shut us out." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, the smallest smile touching her lips. "You already did that," she replied, "the day you left me here." They pushed their way closer, voices overlapping, accusations tumbling out like rehearsed lines. Fraud, manipulation, mental decline. They tried every angle, each one less convincing than the last. Darren hovered near the porch, looking everywhere but at his mother. His guilt was obvious now, raw and twitching beneath the surface. Neil pulled out his phone. "Maybe it's time we get the authorities involved," he said. "You can't legally bar access to family assets." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward the dirt road, calm and unflinching. "By all means," she said softly. Call whoever you like. The confidence in her tone unsettled them. Tiffany whispered something to Darren, but before he could respond, a voice came from behind the fence, low, steady, unmistakably authoritative. That won't be necessary. Everyone turned. It was Mr. Latham, the neighbor Evelyn had met only once, a retired investigator who'd moved to the countryside years ago. He stepped through the gate, holding a small notebook. I've been keeping an eye on this property, he said. Interesting what you see when people think no one's watching. Darren's face drained of color. Latham's words rolled out with practiced precision. He described the day Evelyn had been left there, the car speeding off, the look on her face as she stood alone. He mentioned the date, the time, even the make of the vehicle. You left her here, he said, his tone flat. No supplies, no phone reception, no care. That's abandonment of a dependent adult. In some states, it's a felony. Tiffany sputtered, her voice pitching higher. That's absurd. She's not helpless. Latham looked at Evelyn. No, he said, she's not. But you thought she was. The silence that followed was suffocating. Darren finally spoke, voice breaking. We didn't mean for it to go that far. Evelyn turned to him, eyes steady. You meant for it to go away, she said. And I did. Just not the way you expected. The truth, once spoken aloud, seemed to hang in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. Neil and Carol exchanged uncertain looks, their confidence deflating. Even Tiffany's defiance faltered under the weight of exposure. When it became clear there was nothing left to argue, Darren muttered something about leaving. The group retreated slowly to their cars, the tension following them like a shadow. As engines started and dust rose in the sunlight, Evelyn stood beside Latham, both silent, both watching. You didn't have to step in, she said quietly. He shrugged. Some things don't sit right with me. And besides, people should know someone's watching. He tipped his hat and walked back toward his property, leaving her with a sense of quiet solidarity she hadn't felt in years. The yard was still again. Only the echo of their departure lingered, a faint trail of dust drifting over the field. Evelyn breathed deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs. For the first time, she wasn't alone in the story. There were witnesses now, proof, and that meant the truth had a path of its own, one that would lead straight to justice. She turned back toward the house, the door creaking softly behind her. Tomorrow, she knew, the real reckoning would begin. The letter came a week later, thin, official, stamped with the county seal. Evelyn turned it over in her hands before opening it, already knowing what it contained. The bank investigation had widened. The fraud complaint filed by Marcus had reached the district attorney's office. There would be a hearing. For most people, that word conjures dread. For Evelyn, it sounded like deliverance. She ironed the single dress she owned that wasn't work-stained, borrowed a ride from Mr. Latham, and made the trip into town. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, that sterile blend of history and bureaucracy. When she stepped through the doors, heads turned, not because she looked imposing, but because she radiated something harder to name. Composure. Darren was already there, pacing near the hallway bench, his suit wrinkled, his confidence cracked. Tiffany sat beside him, arms folded, her mouth pressed into a thin line. When their eyes met, Evelyn didn't look away. She simply nodded, as if greeting a stranger. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings unfolded with the precision of a slow clock. Documents were presented, signatures examined, accounts traced. Marcus spoke clearly and without theatrics, laying out the sequence of deception. The forged mortgage, the transfers, the fabricated statements Darren had used to claim ownership. Then came Mr. Latham's testimony. He described that afternoon by the ruined house in plain, unwavering language, what he'd seen, what he'd recorded, how long Evelyn had been left there. His words hit harder than anger ever could. The prosecutor asked him one final question. Mr. Latham, did you believe Mrs. Reed was in danger that day? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Anyone would have been. The room was silent except for the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen. Tiffany's gaze dropped to the floor. Garen's jaw tightened until it trembled. For the first time, their carefully rehearsed innocence had nowhere left to hide. When it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she didn't prepare notes. She simply stood and told the truth. Not the cinematic kind, not the dramatic retelling others might expect. Just the plain, human story of a woman who loved her son too much to see what he'd become. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. He thought leaving me there would be easier than facing me, she said quietly. But the thing about silence is, it remembers, it waits. And one day, it speaks. Even the judge, a woman with years of hard cases behind her, paused before replying. The ruling came quickly after that. The forged mortgage voided, restitution ordered, power of attorney permanently revoked. Darren and Tiffany were found liable for financial abuse and falsified documentation, facing fines and a formal record. There were no handcuffs, no shouting, just the sound of paperwork being stamped. A small sound, but one that felt enormous. When Evelyn stepped out into the afternoon sun, the air felt cleaner than it had in months. Reporters asked for comments. She offered none. Justice didn't need her commentary, it had her truth, and that was enough. Mr. Latham tipped his hat from across the steps. Marcus offered a quiet handshake, and she walked toward the car that would take her home. On the ride back through the rolling fields, the world looked different, sharper, brighter, alive. She thought about the house on the hill, the cracked porch, the rusted stove waiting for her. It wasn't a prison anymore, it was a beginning. In a strange way, she almost wanted to thank her son. His betrayal had stripped away everything false, leaving behind something pure, her will. She turned her face toward the open window, feeling the wind rush against her skin. For the first time in years, Evelyn Reed wasn't surviving someone else's choices, she was living her own. The house looked different now. The same crooked roof still leaned under the weight of years, but sunlight poured through the cracks like forgiveness. Grass had begun to grow where there had once been mud, and the scent of pine drifted through the air with every passing breeze. Evelyn stood at the edge of the porch, watching the valley stretch wide and golden before her. It had been 6 months since the trial. Darren and Tiffany were gone, relocated, silent, small. The bank had restored what was hers. Marcus had handled the rest. But Evelyn didn't think much about money anymore. What she valued most was the sound of her own footsteps across the wooden floor, the freedom of space that belonged entirely to her. The house that had once felt like exile was now her refuge, rebuilt with her own hands, plank by plank, into something whole again. She ran her fingers along the new railing and whispered, almost to herself, "You survived, old girl." We both did. Each morning began the same. Firewood stacked neatly by the door, water drawn from the well, coffee brewed slowly on the stove. There was a rhythm now, a simplicity that reminded her of her childhood, before ambition and disappointment had complicated everything. Sometimes she would find herself humming without realizing it, a faint tune her husband used to whistle when fixing the car. The sound made her smile, not with sorrow but gratitude. On weekends, Mr. Latham would stop by with groceries or small repairs, their quiet friendship growing out of mutual respect rather than need. They rarely spoke about the past. They didn't have to. It hung in the air like an old scar, visible but no longer painful. In the evenings, Evelyn would sit on the porch and watch the sunset drench the valley in color. The same road that had once carried her son away now looked like a promise, a path that led not to loss but to peace. There were still moments, fleeting ones, when memory tugged at her. A photograph she'd kept tucked in a drawer, Darren as a boy grinning with a missing tooth. The sound of a car in the distance that made her heart skip. But those moments no longer carried the weight of grief. They were reminders of what had been, not chains to what still was. Forgiveness, she learned, wasn't something you gave to others. It was something you handed back to yourself. It meant allowing light to touch places you once kept locked. One evening, she took Paul's old armchair from storage and set it beside the window, the same one where she'd first sat terrified and alone. Now, the light that fell through it was warm and full. She whispered softly, "You were right, Paul. There was steel in me after all." Somewhere outside, a bird called, 3 low notes and 1 high, and she smiled at the timing. When night settled over the valley, the stars appeared sharper than she remembered. Evelyn sat beneath them, a blanket around her shoulders, her heart quiet. The world that had once felt cruel now seemed vast and forgiving. She thought of how far she'd come, from the woman who trembled on a dirt road with nothing but a canvas bag, to the woman who had faced down silence and turned it into strength. Justice had been served, yes, but this quiet peace was something greater. She closed her eyes, letting the night wind brush her face. Tomorrow she would plant flowers by the porch, lily or marigolds. Something bright, something alive. Because this house, once meant to bury her, had become her beginning. And as dawn approached, Evelyn Reed, survivor, mother, and maker of her own justice, smiled into the dark. Finally free.